It's going to be a wonderful conversation. So please welcome Louise Penny and Jennifer Knock.
The books are really inspired by a line from Auden, a couple of lines from Auden in his elegy to Melville. And it's, goodness existed, that was the new knowledge. His terror had to blow itself quite out to let him see it. And when I read those lines, long before I became a writer, I understood that I was living in terror. But if my terror could get so big that it could blow itself out, maybe I would find the goodness that I genuinely believed was in the world. And that's what happened. I think 9/11 and a bunch of other personal events just blew my terror out of the water. And when I looked at what was left was goodness. And that's what I place in Three Pines. We reach a fork in the road where, you know, something awful has happened in our lives often, and we either become embittered by it or we become compassionate. And some of the people in Three Pines have become embittered, absolutely. This isn't a cauldron of kindness unremitting. It's a real, it's like Sister Préjean said, that none of us is as bad as the worst thing we have done. And that's explored, that these are good people, but they've done some bad things. And these are some bad people who are capable of acts of great grace. And so that's what we look at, and compassion really does. And that's the thing with Gamache. Gamache, who is the chief of homicide, who could have become embittered, and many of his colleagues have. And we've read a lot of fictional detectives who are embittered and dark and cynical. I love Hitchcock, and I always thought that when I wrote, I wanted to be sort of almost Hitchcockian in my approach, in that the closed door, what is not said is always more frightening than what is said. So I almost never describe the bodies, I intimate. Because I don't have to. I know, I'm a reader, you guys are readers. You wouldn't be listening and watching this if you weren't. So reading is at least as creative as writing. So, I try to hint and intimate and let the reader imagine what it is. And then I don't have to do all that stuff. My books aren't about CSI. There are a whole lot of people who do it a lot better than I ever could. What I do is the only thing I can do, and that's talk about emotions and what happens when emotions turn rancid. And it's often something that's happened years before. In my books, often the murder starts 20 years earlier, where there is some shard that most of us would get over, not even notice, but somehow it's lodged in this person, and it has festered, and it has grown, and it has been buried, but buried alive, and so it just becomes this horrific thing that explodes 20 years later in a murder. That what kills the person isn't the bullet, it's the feeling.
For everyone, I mean, out of all those, how do you approach your writing or your art?
It's the lump in the throat. Thank you for quoting that and for remembering that. That's a line from Robert Frost. Not a poem, but in a letter to a friend, he was describing his process, and in it he said that for him a poem begins as a lump in the throat. And the reason I remember that is that's my books begin as a lump in the throat, as some strongly felt emotion that I need to write about. So that's sort of the start of it. And then then I kind of vomit. The first draft, it becomes a dog's breakfast, which it does. It's like one big pile of something soft and smelly. This huge kind of pile of merde is my first draft. And then the second draft happens, and I cut away, because I know in there somewhere, and I don't know somewhere, it's by the time I come to the end of the first draft, I'm fairly sure what the gems are. I just have to go searching for them. And so the second draft, I cut away more, and the third draft, and by the fourth or fifth, it's really kind of more polishing. And I do 5 or 6 drafts before another human being is allowed to see. It takes that long.
It's also hard to imagine the characters down at the cafe or at the B&B and pulling out their device and checking in on something else, and they're all so fully engaged with each other and where they are that it would seem to kind of run counter to.
As a journalist years ago, I don't even think there was the internet at the time. I was talking to some technology expert, and he was talking about a psychological phenomenon called high tech, high touch. And that stuck with me, because I think that is what we're seeing, that the more high tech our lives become, the more we yearn for intimacy. And that's what Three Pines is. It's a place where, you know, they're not idiots. They have devices and they work when they leave and they drive to another village, and then suddenly everything comes in and the phones ring and stuff. But it is about connecting and intimacy and talking to each other and not checking the device. It was awful. The second book was so difficult to write. I wrote the entire first draft, seeing the deadline coming, and I wasn't happy at all, because I was writing from a place of terror, of wanting to please. And I realize how much the opinion of others has driven me in my life, and it wasn't serving me well. And I went to a therapist, because I didn't want to suffer. I'd suffered writer's block at one stage. I didn't want to suffer it again. And I told her about this problem that I was having, and she said, well, the wrong person is writing the book, which was not initially all that helpful thing to be saying. So I thought she must mean my agent should be writing the effing book. But she said, no, your critic is writing the book. So you have to thank the critic, you have to bless the critic, and you have to show the critic the door. And your creative spirit needs to write the first draft. And if you want to write 10 pages on a sandwich, do it. It's not going to end up in the final draft, you know that. Just write with the joy, write with delight, write with the freedom not to be perfect. Just write with an awareness of how lucky you are that you get to do it. And that just freed me up, and now that's what I do. That's why my first drafts are one big pile of something hot and smelly, because I give myself permission to not be perfect, to make mistakes. Thank you. And thank you, Jen. You were wonderful.